very good afternoon to all of you from the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group. This is SDIG Online Live, the event for February 2023, Black Resistance to Mental Health. Presented by the SDIG Chief Growth Officer, Ms. Patricia Page, and her special guest this afternoon, Dr. Sharon Givens, who is a therapist, executive coach, career counselor, and a career development consultant.
Yes.
Dr. Givens will be speaking on Black resistance to managing mental health in communities of people of color. Dr. Givens has extensive experience developing curriculum, facilitating training, and delivering educational excellence in counseling, career development, and mentorship. As CEO and Director of Visions Counselling and Career Center LLC, which is a private practice offering career counselling and coaching, mental health counselling, and psychological testing, with locations in Columbia, Fort Mill, and Charlotte, North Carolina. Dr. Givens is also the sole proprietor of Training Visions, an international training firm dedicated to providing customized training in career development, diversity and cultural competence, employability concepts, mental health issues, and personality appraisals. So I'd like to hand over to our moderator for today, the Chief Growth Officer for the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group, Ms. Patricia Page.
Thank you, and Happy New Year, and Happy Black History Month. So without further ado, I'll just introduce Dr. Givens. Sadly read her CV, so let's get started. Thank you, Dr. Sharon.
I want to say a special thank you to Ms. Patricia Page for thinking of me, and thanks to all of you in leadership for this opportunity. And I really want to commend you for taking the opportunity to talk about mental health, which is such a critical issue right now and has been in the African American community. So I want to begin by to share my content. Let's just go here. So I thought about what an actual title. Of course, we're going to talk about resistance, but the first thing I want to begin by saying is Black mental health matters. We have to stop suffering in silence. Amid talks of how African Americans have been disproportionately impacted, of course, by COVID and the speculations about being vaccinated. Of course, the Tuskegee experiment has been cited numerous times as kind of the landmark explanations of why African Americans are resistant to seek mental health treatment. Today, African Americans, of course, we face numerous challenges that affect our mental health, including unemployment, poverty, and incarceration, health disparities, and disability. And the emotional and psychological impact of the pandemic, and then the steady uptick of police shootings in the African American community. And so all of these factors, when we look at how it is compiled and how complex it has become, it certainly takes a toll on our mental health. So let's take a look at why is this relevant. Every chance I get, I like to talk about this very important issue, but I think it's good to just reflect and review some of the data regarding this issue. Approximately 1 in 5 adults in the US, we're looking at about 43.8 million people, experiences mental illness each year. 1 in 25 adults in the US, about 9.4 8 million people experience serious mental illness in a given year that substantially interferes with or limits one or more major life activities. So it impedes you to the point where there's something that you were once doing maybe that you're no longer able to do. Now, what is the difference between mental health and mental illness? A lot of people will use the two concepts interchangeably. However, there is a difference. So when we think about mental health, we're thinking about our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. And that's why people, they always make the term about having healthy mental health. It's a display of our emotions. Do we do that in a healthy way? Are we thinking about the same thing over and over again? So it includes our thoughts and our feelings, your ability to solve problems and overcome difficulties. Do you have social connections? And what is your understanding of the world? Now, there are contributors, of course, to our mental health, and that's our genes, meaning, of course, coming from birth, our genetic makeup, our brain chemistry, life experiences certainly impact our mental health, such as abuse and traumatic experiences. Another important factor is a family history, which I've seen in many cases in the African American community, that individuals don't like to acknowledge that there is a history. My mother was mentally ill, or my father was mentally ill, or grandparent, or aunt, or brother, which is a major factor and contributor to our mental health. Mental health also, when we look at, it's the maintenance of successful mental activity, because of course, every day we're engaging in mental activity. And this includes maintaining productive daily activities, fulfilling relationships. In many cases, having a lot of idle time is not healthy for our mental health. This includes the ability to adapt to change. How do you cope with stress? It's normal to have a difficult time when we're feeling stress, and pressure can build up in many areas, like areas of our life, like socially and school. However, if we're consistently feeling sad, hopeless, or worthless, this might be a sure sign that we're experiencing some mental health problems. Now, when we think about mental illness, this is where we move into the realm of a disorder of the brain, which will certainly impact and affect the way you think, feel, behave, and interact with others. How does mental illness occur? A person can develop a mental disorder or mental illness when various psychological symptoms begin to disrupt a person's life. And of course, the evaluator are going to look at the symptoms, actually see what criteria it meets based on the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM-5. So I don't want to go too deep into that, but wanted you to at least have a context of how we diagnose that. So how does mental illness occur? It can occur when the brain or part of the brain is just not working well. It's not functioning abnormally. It's functioning abnormally. And this may be due to trauma, genetics, environment, or some sort of brain disorder. And it's no different than if the heart is not functioning, it's not pumping as much blood as it should. And of course, we go to a cardiologist and hopefully get that resolved. So how does mental health occur? Let's go a little bit deeper here. When we can have disrupted brain signals, then that means that we're having difficulty thinking, focusing. You have a lot of highs and lows. A lot of people may be familiar with the word manic. You're really high, you're all in, you have lots of energy, and then you go to a point where you're stagnant, and then in many cases to the point of catatonic. Sleep problems. In America, we have over 9.5 million people that need a sleep aid every night to actually fall asleep. So, and of course, sleep issues can be attributed to a lot of different factors, but it's certainly one of the core characteristics when we discuss mental health. Let's look at what some of the current knowledge says. Now, most people with mental disorders can live productive and positive lives while receiving treatment. The key here is receiving treatment. Are they taking their medication, or are they working with their provider? In a perfect world, it requires both the medication, but also working with providers, because medication can't give us coping skills and working through, for example, grief. We need to have that relationship with a provider. Some people have severe and persistent mental disorders, which respond poorly to current treatments. It's not always that easy. Sometimes it takes a lot more in terms of the level of treatment. Some ideally will respond at some level and some will not. Mental illness does not respect any boundaries of race, class, geography, age, or gender. It could happen to any person. Most people have a friend. We all probably know somebody that has at least a moderate or severe mental disorder. What are some common adolescent disorders? 1 in 5 children ages 13 to 18 have or will have a serious mental illness, and that could be major depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, panic anxiety, social anxiety disorder, eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, and then various addictions. Now, the impact of that is 50% of all lifetime cases of mental illness actually begin by age 14. 75% of all lifetime cases of mental illness begin by the age of 24. The average delay between the onset of symptoms and interventions is between 8 and 10 years. So there's usually a huge lag between the time people recognize that there's something not right and from the time that they actually will receive care. 37% of students with mental health conditions age 14 and older drop out of school. It's the highest dropout rate of any disability group. 70% of youth in state and local juvenile justice systems have a mental illness. And let's look now specifically at the African American community. I wanted to lay a level of foundation there so you could see the whole landscape in terms of mental health and mental illness. Let's talk a little bit more about, of course, specifically in the African American. 13.4% of the US population would be considered African American, Black, but 16% of those reported having mental illness in the past year. That would be the equivalent to over 7 million people. So if we were to combine Chicago, Houston, and Philadelphia, that would be the total number of people that we're looking at. So African Americans in mental health, just to give you a snapshot here, 20% of African Americans are actually more likely to have serious psychological distress than whites are. And we'll talk more in just a minute about some of those contributors, those variables that feed into this information. Suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death among African Americans. ages 15 to 24. And African American men are 4 times more likely to die by suicide than African American women are. The proportion of African Americans who need mental health treatment and get it is only half that of whites. So this is a really good snapshot to let you know the context of mental health in the African American community. But let's dive just a little bit deeper here. Let's talk about mental health disparities. Of course, there's striking disparities in mental health care for people of color. They're less likely to go for services. And when they do, the quality of care is just not there. It's not excellent quality of care. And regarding mental health, they're underrepresented in research, which is important when we're looking at drugs, theoretical models of treatment. We are not included in that research. So therefore, this imposes a greater disability burden on people of color. And then, of course, we have the cultural disconnects. When we think about the disparities in seeking mental health care, high rates of inpatient. So a lot of people, unfortunately, will go into the mental health system on an involuntary basis. And this means that somebody has went to a judge and said this person needs to be committed, they're a threat to themselves or someone else, versus on a voluntary nature of going to see a counselor or going to check themselves into a facility. We see this in terms of economic gaps, in terms of the affordability. And then providers have lack of cultural competence. When we look at least 1 in 5 resident physicians surveyed from 7 specialties reported not being prepared to deal with cross-cultural issues. Approximately half of residents reported receiving little or no training and understanding how to address patients from different cultures. And so that's extremely alarming, because you have to figure out what then is the quality of healthcare, how people are being damaged in the healthcare system. So I thought it would be good to talk about some of the common African American disorders. And some of this I can attest to from my work in private practice. What kind of issues are most prevalent right now with African Americans regarding mental health? Well, major depression. A lot of people were saying people are depressed due to the pandemic and during the pandemic. What happened is the pandemic put a magnifying glass on issues that were already present. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a very, very common diagnosis for particularly African American kids, mainly boys, not always diagnosed correctly. But the 2 ones that I haven't read that I want to talk a little bit more about is suicide and post-traumatic stress disorder. And then another disorder that many African Americans are dealing with is anxiety. But let's talk a little bit first about suicide. And I can remember, particularly early coming into the field, that suicide just wasn't as prevalent to the African American community. And many people still believe the myth that African Americans just don't commit suicide at a high rate. And a lot of this came from the notion that we are believers, faith background, so therefore we would not do that. But now the rates are alarming in terms of the increase in the number of suicides for African Americans. And one of the things that I really wanted to share with you, let's just look at the full context. Now, nearly 20% of high school students, when we put all high school students here in a pot, report serious thoughts of suicide, and 9% have made an attempt to take their lives. On an average, we have about 132 suicides a day. About 132 people are committing suicide a day. So while youth still die by suicide at a higher rate, African American youth suicide is increasing faster than any other group. So the group now, in terms of the number increase, are African American youth. And we have to say, what is happening? What are they dealing with that our children now feel the best route to go is to commit suicide? 10.3% of Americans have thought about suicide, and 90% of people who died by suicide had a diagnosable mental health condition at the time. The other is trauma. There's so many ways that we can experience trauma, but I wanted to just kind of break down the difference between trauma and PTSD. So a traumatic event is time-based, and that is the actual trauma, while PTSD is the longer-term condition where one continues to have flashbacks or re-experience the traumatic event. So, and PTSD can occur after someone has been through one or more traumatic events. And to meet the criteria for PTSD, there must be a high level of ongoing distress and life impairment. So the traumatic event is actually time-based. Now, PTSD can go on for years and years and years. So some of the major ways that particularly African Americans experience trauma, even the historical concepts, when we think about what our ancestors may have been through, can be very, very traumatic. We have experienced and continue to experience racial trauma, particularly in the workplace, sexual and physical abuse, domestic violence, community violence, emotional abuse, neglect, natural disasters. If you go and look at some of the research of the mental health of the African Americans that went through Hurricane Katrina, it is appalling. So we can be traumatized greatly, even going through a natural disaster. And then, of course, loss, grief. That can be a divorce, that could be a job, somebody dies suddenly can certainly be a major trauma to us as well. Now, where do you think the resistance comes from? Why particularly are African Americans so resistant about going to get help? So the first is going to be the stigma. I don't want this. There's such a stigma. And I often reflect on how did we create this stigma, particularly in the African American community? So some of the words that people tend to use, particularly in the African American community, which makes us afraid to even talk about mental health. You're psycho, you're weirdo, you're crazy, you're schizo, you're a basket case, you're wacko. People don't want to be associated with any of those terms. So a stigma is when somebody views you, of course, in a negative way because you have a distinguishing characteristic or personal trait that's thought to be a disadvantage. Now, when we say mental health stigma, what do we mean? So the public stigma is the negative reactions that people may experience after revealing they have a mental health disorder or have sought help for mental health. And then the private stigma is rooted in how people view themselves for seeking treatment or experiencing mental health issues. So we have the public stigma for what others after revealing, and then we have our own private stigma. What can mental health stigma look like in Black communities? Oh, we don't suffer from mental illness, and this stems from some kind of immunity hypothesis. Let's keep it inside the family. What happens in the house stays in the house. And a lot of this can stem from misdiagnosis, overdiagnosis, historically and in the present. And it's meant to be protective, but really, really hurts us. Our ancestors have been through much worse. So if they've dealt with all of that, you certainly can deal with this. This is absolutely true, but this does not mean we want to experience trauma from racism and oppression that's happening in the present day. What can mental health stigma look like in Black communities? I'm strong enough to handle this on my own. We're strong and resilient people. We know this. Strength still needs support. If I go to therapy, then that means I don't have enough faith. One of the things Bishop T.D. Jakes says is, I don't believe that you can always use a spiritual antidote to a mental or emotional problem. I think you have to treat what is hurting with what is necessary to get better. The other major reason for resisting and being resistant to mental health is trust. And for most African Americans, our trust has been broken somewhere along the way. It could be from the workplace, from healthcare experiences, relationships. And so we do not trust. And so what are some of the major trust factors? History, experiences, medical racism, and being in various environments in which people have not been empathetic. So there was a poll in October 2020 that said 7 of 10 Black Americans say they're treated unfairly by the healthcare system, and 55% say they distrust it. So it's really, really challenging to say that I will go seek help and become extremely vulnerable in a place that I don't trust. What are some barriers to mental health? Why so few African Americans receive mental health care? Lack of access, particularly in our rural areas. We don't have facilities. A lot of the county facilities are no longer operating. Lack of insurance or financial resources. It costs money. And poor cultural understanding by therapists. I'm not going to see somebody that doesn't understand me, my struggles. So let's look at a few strategies and techniques here. One of the things that I think is important and I consistently promote, because I've seen even in my work and my practice, is gaining value and respect for mental health. Having people not show up, just stop coming, push boundaries, and in general, just lack a level of investment in the process. I think we have to begin with preventive measures as well, recognizing, and let's think about this even as individuals, recognizing our own symptoms, eating better, exercising, practicing daily self-care, taking time for yourself regularly, just making sure that you have some time for yourself on a daily basis or on a consistent basis. Sleeping, managing your stress diligently. We tend to let it pile up into clusters versus just dealing with things as they come. Know where to get help. Manage your circle. And I've seen this quite a bit, and thinking about some of the patients that I have, a lot of their stress comes from their circle. The people that they're engaged in terms of their relationships, their families. They have not learned to set appropriate boundaries. Therefore, it has certainly impacted their mental health. It's important for us to take an opportunity to self-assess. So one little quick way I always offer people is to say, do you feel angry often or worried? Do reckless things that could harm you or others? Do you ever feel grief for a long time? Do you think about the same thing over and over again? Are you using excessive alcohol or drugs? Exercise, diet, and or binge eat obsessively? Do you hurt other people? Do you destroy property? Do you harbor emotional pain? And if you ever feel like any of these, it's important to go and address these individually or collectively. Maintaining positive mental health. Strategies for maintaining positive mental health can include staying connected with friends and family who can provide emotional support, engaging in physical activity every day, saying no to new responsibilities when you know your plate is already full. I can't say enough about getting sleep at night. Sleep impacts so many different factors of our lives, physically and mentally. And then seeking help from a mental health professional when stress becomes overwhelming. It's important for us to create a positive outlook. I've known a lot of people are just negative, which impacts our mental health. It's important for us to monitor those thoughts. What is it that you're thinking about? Where did that come from? What's the root of that? And how do I address it? Identify ways to develop a positive outlook. And I often give my clients gratitude exercises. It can provide an instant mental shift when we get into a space of gratitude. So if we were to develop an attitude of gratefulness, that would make a difference as well. Focus on your character strengths. Use positive reframing. Sometimes the way that we look at things, there's actually another way that you can look at the same concept. So a few final thoughts I have for you. The power of purpose. And I always work with my clients on their purpose. We tend to be more balanced and monitor our mental health when we're operating in purpose. Laugh for at least an hour a day. Depression is truly a silent killer. There's so many people who are depressed. They don't show it outwardly, but inwardly, it's killing them physically and mentally. Stay connected to positive people. Talk about it. There's so many things that we would feel much better about if we just talked about it. Walk it out. Even if you start to feel a little down in a day, get outside, go for a walk, particularly on a sunny day. Develop resilience. We know that good times, hard times will come, but if you have enough in your toolbox, you can be resilient to overcome when the difficult times come. Ask how to help. Be aware of your own negative stereotypes and stigmatizing attitudes. Have you conveyed that to family members, to friends? Seek further advice and information as needed. Stop, think for a minute, understand. If you don't understand what the person is experiencing, do research, ask questions, and be available to support. So how can we shift the narrative about mental health, particularly in our mental health care systems? Access to quality, appropriate, and culturally responsive mental health care, building trust with Black communities, community-based treatment options, creating models of care that center Black experiences. And this is huge, creating a pipeline of training Black mental health professionals and hiring them into a field and leadership positions. Right now, we have two great resources that you can look at online: Therapy for Black Men, Therapy for Black Girls, where we do have therapists that are dedicated specifically to Black men and to Black young girls and women. Remember, mental health is health. A lot of people like to make a major distinction between the two. They will go see even a podiatrist, a gynecologist, but not a psychiatrist. Healing takes time, and asking for help is a very courageous step. So I want to end on an affirmation. As a Black person, I deserve to live a healthy, full life in which I am safe, I'm valued, and affirmed. I want to thank you. Did any light bulbs come on? And then I have a few minutes. If someone has questions or any comments, I would love to entertain those.
Thank you, Sharon. I can call you Sharon because you're my friend. So I failed to mention that I met Sharon about 7 or 8 years ago, I think. We were in a training, a leadership development class in Baltimore, Maryland. I won't tell the story. However, I've grown to love Sharon. And at the end of the session, I said to Sharon, I was like, girl, I got to get you some of this federal government money. She was like, oh, that's what everybody says. I was like, okay. Well, about 6 months later, I called Sharon. I was like, look, I need your services because my employees are driving me crazy. I don't know how you're going to set up this statement of work, but just set it up where it looks like you're going to be doing some career development. But I know you are a psychotherapist, and that's what my staff needs. Well, anyway, she's been servicing my, even though I'm retired, she's still servicing my employees for the last, what, 3, 4 years. And so mental health is really, or illness, I say, is really rampant. So I want to thank you for sharing your time. And don't forget, you got to give me my free session. Okay. Okay. But Sharon, my question is, I want to think about mental illness. So how does mental illness affect sentencing for Black men? If they have mental illness, do they tell the judge? Will their lawyers or their family members tell the judge that there's some mental illness, but what's in writing, not just verbally telling them? And does that affect their sentencing?
You know, that's a really good question because, as I said, probably at least 70–80% of the people, adults who are incarcerated, have some sort of mental illness. I think a lot depends on the crime. It depends on the case. Do they allow that information? But particularly for Black men, if you look across the landscape, you don't see a lot of leniency for mental illness unless somebody is just completely declared, at the time of the crime that they were just completely aware. But if you look across particularly high profile cases, no. Because a lot of times too, the judge looks at it as we have an option to get treated. So if you chose not to treat that mental illness, then sometimes it doesn't give you the ground to stand on in a criminal case.
Okay. All right. Are there any other questions? William, do you have a question? Amanda? Mr. Adam? William, you have a question? I see you open your mic.
I don't. Thank you, Sharon.
Okay.
Very, very important information, especially in regards to the spiritual component. Having practiced ministry for over 30 years, the spiritual component is definitely a deterrent for mental health. And the African American church itself is sick.
Well, and William, I want to say this, and I've done some of that work here in the South, but to be honest, every church needs to have this session. That's a part, because the church is a key platform for the African American community, but the churches are not talking enough about this. And I presented to like state conventions for churches, and oh, we're going to do something, we're going to have you to come in, and it just lies dormant because the church has the Black audience. And if they are to get this information, the church would be one of the key places to get it.
Challenge is, Sharon, Black ministers feel are averse to mental health treatment because they themselves, in most cases, need therapy.
And I agree. And that's another session. That's another session. But I mean, and it's hard if you're sick to heal other people. But that, so I think until many of the religious leaders just disarm themselves and make themselves a little more vulnerable, then we're going to continue to have this issue. Because in Black communities, the clergy they have a platform to do this.
Yes, okay. Are there any other questions?
Yeah,
Amanda?
Dr. Given, I want to first of all thank you for coming. I wish that this had worked the way usually does, because I think that you brought in a pertinent information for all of us. The issue of race or infrastructure of racism permeates every aspect of the society.
Mm-hmm.
The question then becomes, how do we disseminate this information? It's not a new thing that we don't even have psychiatrists or people who are conversant with some of these issues that are often unspoken. And because they don't have people who can even determine it and call it what it is, based on my experience in the area of management or during the MBA program, you cannot solve a problem you can't clearly define. The first way is to define it. So what I'm trying to get at is, without really going to come up in a complicated way, is looking at the range of issues, almost every aspect of life.
Mm-hmm.
And the church you mentioned, which has been the, should I say, the core of upbringing, whether it's religious development, intellectual development, or every aspect of life. How do we, for people like you, specialists in this mental health, because mental health, in my view, I think, it stems from all kinds of things, and it's just unimaginable. So one can predict that almost every, like the person William stated, even the church leaders, they have their own mental health. Mm-hmm. So if they have their mental health, that the people who are supposed to be able to help. How, for those of you who are in the field, of course, you are very few of you in that field, I mean, African Americans. How do you wrap your head around the kind of policy that will galvanize force? Because we don't have enough of you. We gotta galvanize the efforts to bring those who may be interested in supporting the same thing, so that you can build the maximum mass in order to begin to tackle the very complicated problem we have.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we do need more people. I think there has to be really institutional to create an infrastructure, for example, to train more mental health providers, to give incentives, for example, for people to go into this field, maybe more scholarships, more opportunities. also this has to start in the career development phase with students. A lot of kids aren't exposed to mental health treatment or knowing about being a mental health professional at an early age. So that's another key issue as well. Also, I think a lot of people, it's just in terms of African American, it's not on their radar in terms of career choices and creating that value for mental health, because that's where we really have to start, is creating the value for mental health in our communities. And I talked about that in terms of missing appointments and abandoning services and those sorts of things.
Okay.
But I think we have to have some incentives for people to do this work, because it's not easy work. It's not easy work.
Well, I think that's a very perplexing one, because we have a system that I think is based on, will I say, if you don't have the necessary network, you don't have the sort of financial support system, you may be doing so much to help, but that help would be so minimal, because you wouldn't really, you're not going to go to the extent of reflecting something that people can begin to even look at and say, oh, this person is, the action helped. The other person will see that the action helped. That process through which people communicate with people, just talking to one another, would actually motivate some people who would otherwise deny the existence of what they may be going through to actually open up. That one is locked up. Then looking at interconnectedness of whom you know, how do you navigate? Whom can you trust? Now, looking at, again, I heard you talk about trusting issue, and I was looking at Stephen, the guy that does the work he does in Alabama. I can't remember the name, Stephen. I can't remember his name. But as you look at the people who are languishing in jail for offenses they know little or nothing about, then you look at the one, Barry Shacks, the attorney, with other people who are working to open up to the system that have lied about people, put people on, and ruined their lives, to figure out how do we, because mental health, all those things are parts and parcels of the mental health. If people have done something, you know, that is egregiously wrong, that could, like I was telling some people last time, that when you hear that people went and killed people, sometimes you're gonna wait and look and ask, what propelled people to take that to that level?
Right. Well,
you know,
right. And I'm going to address that, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to move forward. But one of them, and if you look at the percentage of African American kids who get therapy versus other races, that's one of the problems, because many of these issues start when kids are young and parents are in denial and they refuse to believe that there's something happening with their child, because it's always easier to address these issues at a young age, because you have to think about, as we get older, they progress. So I could have dealt with this much easier when you were 10, but by the time you come to me at 40, I have to sift through everything that's been happening and the discourse of that since you were 10. So that's a part of the issue. People aren't as open in the African American community to send their kids to therapy. So I'm sorry, I've got to transition. Feel free, you have my email address, and I'll just put that there very quickly. I don't know if you can see that, but Pat, if you want to put it back up on the screen.
I'll send it back. Yeah.
Okay.
So we're going to have to have you to, Sharon,
Sure.
we're going to have you to come back again. So, because I think
wonderful. Because there's
so
a
I will
lot
get
to
with
talk
you.
about. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Sharon, and we'll talk later
Okay.
on today. Check
Thank
check
you.
your text message that I
Okay.
sent you.
Okay. Thank
All
you
right.
very much. Okay.
Thank
All
you
right.
very
Thank you.
much, Dr. Given. I
All
appreciate
right.
it.
Thank y'all so much. I would love to talk
All right.
more with you. Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you very
Thank
much
you,
indeed, Dr.
Sharon.
Givens. And we'll close this session with Ms. Patricia Page and Dr. Sharon Givens, the CEO and Director of Visions Counselling and Career Centre and proprietor of Training Visions, with thanks from SDIG, the team here in London, and also the team in Maryland. So very many thanks to Ms. Gibbons. And for those of you that were not able to attend live, this session will be on the SDIG YouTube channel sometime in the next week. Thank you very much indeed,
All right.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
And good
everyone.
night.